Welcome to my messy studio, everyone. My name is Mark, and I'm an artist and an art professor, as well as a fountain pen enthusiast who uses them to make art. In this video, we're going to finally and conclusively answer this question. What is the difference between the two major German manufacturers of fountain pen nibs, Jowo and Bock? I'm going to put these two nibs against each other in a series of tests, draw them extensively, and then give you an artist's perspective on the differences, and then tell you which one is better for drawing. Let's get started. Information on Jowo is fairly scarce, at least in English. Richard Binder's webpage, which has tons of fountain pen information and is a fantastic resource, says that the company was originally founded in Berlin in 1852 under the name Heinz and Blankertz and was the first manufacturer of nibs in Germany. However, it has gone through many iterations, being destroyed in World War II, rebuilt and nationalized in 1949, going bankrupt in 1994, before being reconstituted by two employees of the company, Joachim Hildebrand and Wolfgang Lemme, who used the first two letters of their names to create a new name for the company. The company now makes steel and gold nibs for a large number of pen manufacturers. Their nibs can also be bought separately through a number of sellers, many of which are branded with a store name, such as Goulet pens and Goldspot pens. More info is to be found on Bock, and there's a detailed article online by the Southern Scribe that relates to history as well as additional information on the company's website. The company was founded by Peter Bock in Heidelberg in 1939 as an independent family business, but was recently acquired by the pen manufacturer Schneider. The company produces steel, gold, and titanium nibs for a number of pen makers, and, like Jowo, they can also be bought separately. There are a number of factors which make an accurate comparison of these nibs difficult. The first is that these nibs are sometimes tuned by the pen manufacturer to work to their specifications. The second complicating factor is the filling system of the pen, which also affects performance. Pens that use converters tend to have drier flow than pens with built-in filling systems. My guess is because the converter's small ink capacity inhibits ink flow. The third complication is that some manufacturers, while using Bock and Jowo nibs, use them in their own proprietary housing, or no housing at all. This will change the performance of the nib significantly, making a comparison worthless. For my comparison, I tried to eliminate these complicating factors as much as possible. Here are the pens that I'll be using. This is an Asveen V200, which comes with a Bock extra fine nib and housing, and this is the Asveen J16, which comes with a Jowo extra fine nib and housing. First, Asveen pens are moderately priced, so one can safely assume that no tuning was done in either nib. Secondly, both pens have built-in filling systems with large ink capacity, with the V200 being a vacuum filler and the J16 being a piston filler. While different filling systems do affect the performance of the pen, I think we can call it close enough. And since both use housing units made for their respective nibs, we can expect for each nib to perform as intended. Lastly, we're going to limit this test to just one size of nib and one line weight, a number 6 extra fine. While I have Jowo and Bock nibs in various sizes, they're not in similar enough pens to make for a fair comparison. As for comparing nibs of various line weights, I'm only going to compare their extra fine nibs, which I use most often, which I feel are best suited for drawing. For those of you looking for a more comprehensive comparison of nibs of every single material, single size, and line weight, my apologies. But that would make for one very tedious video. For these tests, I'm going to be working on Strathmore 300 series Bristol paper, a surface that is both hard, smooth, and non-absorbent. I've filled both pens with my usual testing ink, Noodler's Lexington Gray, a well-flowing ink whose transparency allows us to better see the ink flow in each pen. Let's start with a consistency test. First is the Jowo nib, and here is the Bock. Both perform perfectly, putting down lines without skipping in every direction and at every speed. No surprises here, since this is exactly what you expect from these nibs and why you find them featured in so many high-end pens. This is where, unfortunately, Chinese nib manufacturers still fall behind slightly. While their nibs can sometimes be good, often they need to be adjusted to work correctly. With these nibs, almost without fail, they work right out of the box as intended. By the way, nothing against Chinese pen makers who deserve a lot of credit for innovating and producing interesting pens. And by the way, many Jowo nibs nowadays are made in China. In the flex department is where we see a marked difference. The Jowo has a slight flex to it, going from an extra fine line to something almost approaching a medium. A nice degree of flex, easy to control, and enough for most sketching and drawing purposes. However, the nibs do not work well in reverse, producing a very faint and scratchy, inconsistent line. In the flex rating, I would give this nib a 2. On the other hand, the Bock nib has much more line variation to it, first because it starts off with a finer line, and because it ends at a full medium. This puts it close to the soft nib category, almost something like a Pilot Custom 74 Soft Fine or a Pilot Falcon. And in reverse, it writes more effectively, putting down a consistent extra fine line. So in the line variation, I would place this at about a 2.5 or maybe even higher, though I think 3 is where the soft nib category really starts, so maybe not. In the feedback test, we have slight differences as well, with the Jowo nib having a pleasant pencil-like feedback, and the Bock nib being slightly scratchier. Neither is unpleasantly scratchy, however, but if you're sensitive to feedback, this is a consideration. And in the flow test, the Jowo has an ever so slightly wetter flow to it. If you enjoy wetter writing nibs, neither is a great choice. But the great news is that wetness can be adjusted by pulling the shoulders of the nib back, something I demonstrate in my video called Stupid Pen Tricks, the link to which I'll leave below. You can also buy ebonite feeds from the Flexible Nib Factory, which feed either into Jowo or Bock housing, which provide a wetter writing experience. Now let's do some drawing with both nibs and see how they perform in practice. I'm switching over to my favorite sketchbook, the Art Creations made by Talens, but continuing to work with Noodler's Lexington Gray. In this comparison, I deliberately chose pens that were roughly in the same price range, weight, and dimensions. But since I couldn't use identical pens, I couldn't take the differences in the pens completely out of the equation. The V200 has some advantages over the J16, a much larger ink capacity since it's a vacuum filler, and a clear demonstrator body which allows you to see how much ink is in the pen. But the J16 is the better pen in terms of ergonomics, with better weight and balance. That's one area where the V200 fails, due to a giant, solid metal piston knob which makes the pen back heavy and clunky feeling. I will do my best, however, to ignore the differences in the pen bodies and think only about the nibs. Let's start with the Jowo nib. The first thing I noticed is that on this paper, the nib wrote wetter than on the hard Bristol paper, leading to a wider line. This has to do with the paper being slightly more absorbent, leading to a wicking effect, and that in a sketchbook, the paper is sitting on a soft bed of other papers underneath, allowing the nib to dig deeper into the paper. I find the additional wetness welcome, since Jowo nibs can be very dry. My point in telling you this is that a nib's performance is also dependent on the paper and, of course, the ink being used, which is yet another reason why a review like this cannot be comprehensive. Okay, what general conclusions can be made about the Jowo nib? Well, these are great starter nibs for the beginning draftsman who needs something perfectly reliable and consistent. These are the quintessential workhorse nibs, and I have yet to encounter a pen that uses a number 6 Jowo nib and housing unit that doesn't perform exactly as it should. The line is dry enough that you don't have to worry about waiting for areas to dry before going over them, and you can tease some degree of line variation out of them if you need to. The consistency and uniformity of line makes these great transitional nibs for those of you out there who are used to working with felt tip liners, and is what I would hand an artist who has never used a fountain pen before. The Bock nib, on the other hand, felt like a much more sensitive, expressive instrument. Again, while not a flex pen, or even something that could be considered a soft nib, the Bock is still capable of producing elegant calligraphic lines. This nib takes more skill to get the full benefit, so if you're just starting out in pen drawing or don't use line variation in your work, go with a Jowo nib. However, if you are getting into line variation, the Bock nib is a great stepping stone to truly flexible nibs. There are two drawbacks to the Bock nib, however. First is its greater feedback. Some people, myself included, don't mind it, but if you come to expect butter on ice smoothness, you'll be disappointed. This can be knocked down a bit using 1200 grit micro mesh, which you can buy online, but you have to be careful since over-polishing can create problems with skipping. The second drawback is dryness. Again, this can be adjusted, but if you're looking for a sloshy wet line, this is not the nib to reach for. To summarize, while these two nibs are comparable, there are significant differences. The Jowo is stiffer and wetter, better for entry-level users or artists who work in a style that does not require much flex. The Bock is more flexible, drier, and scratchier, better for more advanced users and those who enjoy line variation, but are not quite ready to make the full dive into the wild, wet world of flex. While I think Bock is the better nib for drawing, I don't use it nearly as often as the Jowo. Why? It all comes down to availability and compatibility. Jowo nibbed pens are far more common, with some notable higher-end brands being Opus 88, Franklin Christoph, and Edison. On the lower end, now you can get an excellent Asvine J16 with a Jowo nib and housing. Bock is used in fewer pens, with some brands being Keras Customs, Kaweco, and Konit. At lower price points, you can now get Bock nibs in a number of Asvine pens like the V200 and the P36. But the main issue is this. While these nibs are both the number 6 size, the Bock is slightly wider with a slightly flatter curvature towards the back. This means that the Jowo nib will work just fine in Bock housing, but the Bock nib has a harder time fitting into Jowo housing, and even if you can get it to fit, doesn't sit as well on the Jowo feed, leading to excessive dryness and ink starvation. So, Jowos work well in Bock housing, but not the other way around. And Jowo's compatibility is not only limited to Bock housing, but to tons of other pens that use number 6 size nibs. Here are just 3 nice affordable options. The Asvine V126, an excellent vacuum filling pen. The Pen BBS 456, another very solid vacuum filler, and the Moonman C4, an eyedropper filling pen with a built-in safety valve and a poorly endowed looking clip. Sadly, Bock's incompatibility also extends to other pens, so unless the pen is designed specifically to use Bock nibs, you're, as far as I know, out of luck. I say as far as I know because while I've tried and failed to fit a number of Bock nibs into a number of different pens, I don't have every possible pen brand to try out. If anyone out there has successfully transplanted a Bock nib into an inexpensive pen body, please let me know. The good news is that you can now buy an adapter of sorts, a Jowo housing unit that accepts Bock nibs from a company called Flexible Nib Factory. The setup costs about $40 and, best of all, comes with an ebonite feed which gives you better ink flow. I hope you enjoyed this nib comparison, and if you did, please subscribe and consider becoming a channel member. Thanks for watching, and see you back in my messy studio very soon. Bye for now.